Okay. So yes, we could sit and have a great conversation all night about any number of things, which, by the way, is kind of how the Talmud ended up getting written, because they'd sit down, they'd start discussing a piece of Mishnah, and they'd end off realm of discussion, and then they'd have to come back and begin the next Mishnah. And we learned a lot by those side transgressions, which is why until the Rif came along and wanted to actually make it easier for people to find the answers. But that's a whole nother story. See, we're on another tangent already. All right, Horayot, chapter 1, Mishnah 5. We have been coming back and back and back again and again and again to the question that you guys have having. Wait a minute, so who actually is paying for this? Who's taking care of the sacrifice that's being made when the court has made an error in its judgment? And we're now going to, kind of. We're not going to be done. You still have to hold off a few other questions, but at least we're going to get some progress on that point. Good? Okay, so once again, just a recap, because it is kind of a unfamiliar topic to us. We're dealing with a case where a court has made a decision in error that has then been acted on by the community, and they now know that it was a mistake. They've retracted that decision. That's right, but there needs to be a sacrifice, a la the book of Leviticus, the book of Vayikra. Is how does that sacrifice work? And the sacrifice, again, is only happening for if they made a decision regarding a particular transgression whose punishment would be karet if it was done on purpose, be a sin offering if done by accident. And of course, by accident is what we've been trying to narrow it down to in this case. Good. All right, are you up for reading?
Oh, yes, look at that.
I don't want to use you. It's
yes. So Mishnah 5.1. If the court ruled in error and all the people, or a majority of them, acted accordingly, they bring a bull. And in the case of idolatry, they bring a bull and a goat. These are the words of Rabbi Meir.
Both the first part and part A are the words of Rabbi Meir. Okay? So what we're dealing with here is these are the people. The people are revolting. Give them a bath.
Oh.
So what we're dealing with here is if everybody sins, right, or at least a majority sins, let's call it 99 to 100%, right, whatever, once we're over the majority of the community sinning based off this false ruling, then Rabbi Meir says bull or plus goat if it is an idolatrous case because of the additional rules on idolatry. And this is Rabbi Meir. Okay.
The bull wasn't for the court.
Yes.
That was the price for the court.
Right.
And now you're talking for the community.
No.
The court and the community, right?
Who is bringing the bull on behalf of the whole community because of the mistake the court made. Right, so the court is bringing this, and that's very important because he's saying one court made the mistake, the majority of the people in the community did the deed, therefore the one court brings one offering. Right, that's going to change when we get other opinions here in just a second.
And Rabbi Judah says the 12 tribes bring 12 bulls. 12 bulls and 12 goats.
Okay, so this is Rabbi Meir's, I have no idea, diagram this. That's Rabbi Meir's opinion. Right? Meir believes one people, one sacrifice, whatever that sacrifice needs to be, bull or bull and goat. Rabbi Yehuda has a different opinion. He says, no, look, you've got, I'm not going to do all the 12, right? But you've got tribes. I can spell at least the word tribes. And if the tribes have sinned, you need to bring 12 bulls.
Plus wives at this point in time?
No. But they are trying to understand how the halacha actually applied when it was first given, which was in the days of the Torah when there were tribes. So they want to know, if you will, the hypothetical answer to this question. And Rabbi Yehuda is saying 12 tribes, or however many marks I just made on that bar, right? If the 12 tribes, question of, a majority of the tribes, our bar is filling in this way, right? If they sin, then each one of them, however many we got, right, are all bringing sacrifices. Right, so what's the different view on community between these two opinions?
No, tribes.
Right, so Rabbi Meir says we
One
have
body.
one nation,
One nation.
right? We have one nation. We have one nation, and actually it is kind of indivisible. And if the majority of the nation, even if it was 10% of Yehuda and only 1% of the tribe of Dan,
Everybody.
then only one court is responsible for this. Or if it was 51% of each tribe, or whatever we needed to get to our magic majority. One court, one nation, one sacrifice. Rabbi Yehuda is saying, no, it doesn't work like that. We are in pieces, right? We do have tribes. And each tribe is responsible for the adjudication, the implementation of the law within their area. There are regional courts. They are responsible, each, for the implementation. Therefore, they are responsible for the error. They're responsible for the community as it is assembled from its pieces to make good on the sacrifice when it happens. You can't say that it was just them that was responsible, right? It's not just the court that made the mistake for all of us. It was all of us under the court that are responsible for what happened. Right, so this is a very interesting, in the modern sense, sort of between a federalist and a state power kind of view of government. Right? Where does the power really lie? Does the power lie just in one body, the court? Or does the power actually lie in all of us, even though one group made that decision, we are all responsible for it? I think, hypothetically, who's responsible in Germany for World War II? The Nazi Party or Germany? Right? Who's responsible for the destruction of the native tribes of the North American continent? Right? Just the generals? Just the presidents? Just the congresses? All of the states that were part of the Union at the time. Where the power lies, Rabbi Yehuda is basically saying the power lies with the people. And therefore the representation of the people has to be made for the people. Even though it was just a court, we are all implicated. And therefore we have to each express in our most basic group that we are seeking atonement for this transgression. Make sense? Okay. And then we get a third opinion, which I'll have to squeeze on the page somewhere.
Rabbi Shimon says 13 bullocks, and in the case of idolatry, 13 bulls and 13 goats, a bull and a goat for each tribe, and a bull and a goat for the court.
Okay, so what he basically does, and I don't really need to draw this, is he says this one plus this one equals 13, right? That we can't let the court off, in quotes, because they are the ones who made the decision. And we also can't let the people off because they are the people for whom the decision was being made. They are the nation. So therefore, we need to have bull for the court, and that gets us to 13. Interesting. The halacha, according to the Gemara, is the middle line, right? That it is ultimately invested within the people, the kahal, that is being moved. And that's going to be reinforced when we look at the opinions in Part 2.
If the court ruled in error and 7 tribes, or a majority of them, acted accordingly, they bring a bull. And in the case of idolatry, they bring a bull and a goat. These are the words of Rabbi Meir.
All right. So I may need
who bring a bull here?
the court. One we're back to. So the answer is going to be the same for these things. But let me go ahead and see if I can't make it clear, because we're dealing with the case study here of before we had the majority, right, which was our beginning, or now we have a different type of majority, right, which is the number of tribes. So again, remember, some tribes like Judah and Ephraim, they were massive, and some tribes like the mighty tribe of Benjamin, not so much. So what we're dealing with now is what happens if you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 tribes, right, that actually transgress, but the other tribes outnumber them in terms of actual human bodies. Excuse me. So you've got 7 tribes, not drawn to scale. You got 7 tribes that have transgressed. So you have a majority of tribes that have transgressed, but a minority of people, because the tribes are fewer in number by people than the larger block of the other 5 tribes. 7, 5, yeah. And vice versa. What happens if you have a majority of the tribes, but it's a minority, a majority of the people, but a minority of tribes? You know, you could have 3 tribes that have done the transgression and everyone else was involved. Those 3 tribes make up a majority of the total people. The 2 cases that we're dealing with in this section. Making sense? Okay. So Rabbi Meir is true to his course, right? He says 1 court, 1 mistake, 1 sacrifice covers it all. However,
Rabbi Judah said, the 7 tribes who sinned must bring 7 bulls. Who did not sin must bring bulls on their behalf.
what?
Well, yeah. Right.
Wait a minute.
It's no different than first.
Right? Well, it's no different in the total number of bulls being brought, right? And that's a lot of bull. Sorry, I just couldn't resist. I had to get it out.
And in the blame.
But well, is it a question of blame?
Not really.
Right?
Or
Or
it says, even those who did not sin, the ones who did sin.
right. Why not? I mean, why?
We are
It's one nation.
Because we are one nation, right? We are responsible for each other, and we are responsible for helping to effect atonement for each other. And that is Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. And again, Rabbi Yehuda wins in this case, and it is very consistent with his opinion in the first one. Whereas Rabbi Shimon has a slightly different view.
Rabbi Shimon said 8 bulls. Idolatry, 8 bulls and 8 goats. A bull and a goat for every tribe. The court.
Right. So he again tries to marry the 2 positions by saying there's a court set of sacrifices, and then there are the people who did wrong set of sacrifices, and that's good enough. But again, we know the halacha goes by Rabbi Yehuda. Good? Okay. Part 3.
Is that Judah the prince?
Yes, that is Yehuda Hanasi. Yes.
If the court of one of the tribes, or the court of one of the tribes ruled in error, and that tribe acted accordingly, that tribe is liable. But all the other tribes are exempt. Judah.
All right. So Rabbi Yehuda says if the court was really a limited court, meaning a court just within a tribal area, and that court's ruling only affected that tribe and only people of that tribe acted on it and therefore unwittingly transgressed, then yes, says Rabbi Yehuda, then you're dealing with a case of only that tribe has to bring the sacrifice.
What is the minority? What about 2 tribes? Also,
If you're
there's
under,
only 2 tribes that
If you are-
mistake and 2 tribes sent. It still is going by the 1 or going by the 12.
right, so less than 7 tribes
Minority.
or less than 50%. Right? As long as you are less than the majority of the community, measured either by tribes or by absolute population, that did it, says Rabbi Yehuda. But the Hachamim, the majority of the sages, are going to say,
There is no liability except as a result of the rulings of the highest court, where it says, and if the whole congregation of Israel shall err, but not the congregation of one particular tribe.
Right. So as we say, we are one people, which was our answer to the middle question. If we're one people, then only the court of the whole people can make this kind of mistake that triggers the effect that we discuss in the section of Leviticus that we're dealing with. So therefore, the regional court can make a mistake and then need to make a retraction, and that's all very well and good, but the individuals who committed the transgressions while operating under the false idea of the court, they're going to be responsible for, this means Nathaniel's been picked up, they're going to be responsible for their own individual sin offerings rather than the court, because it wasn't a case of collective mistake. Because for it to be a collective mistake, it had to be acting on the collective, because they were a local regional section. How's that sound? Logical? Makes sense? Whew. Second chapter. We made it, finally. Okay, so if you were still reading along in the book of Leviticus, by the time you got to chapter 4, you would come across the following case. And this is at the top. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion of Horayot, I'm going to read a few of these introductions because this is sections of Vayikra that we're not always paying close attention to when we do the public readings. All right, so Leviticus 4:3 states, if it is the anointed priest who has incurred guilt, not the court, we're talking about the priest, the Kohanim, so that the blame falls upon the people, he shall offer for the sin of which he is guilty a bull of the herd without blemish as a sin offering of the Lord. Right? So this is him making a ruling wrong. Rather than the court making a ruling, it's when the high priest is making a ruling. But you'll notice that the atonement is the same, that the sacrifice has to be made. So as you might then expect, if it's the same setup and the same type of fix, many of the rules are going to be very similar. Good? Shall we see how that plays out? Good. So Mishnah 1 from chapter 2.
An anointed priest who rendered a decision for himself in error and acted unwittingly accordingly must bring a bull.
Right. So same setup that we had before, but here it's where the priest is doing the rendering of decisions and facing the consequences for having, some situation.
Rendered the decision in error, but acted upon it willfully, or made it willfully, but acted on it unwittingly, he is exempt. For a decision a high priest made for himself is like a ruling issued by the court to the community.
Okay. And again, this doesn't mean exempt as in no problem from the particular requirements of this section of atonement of bringing this bull in this particular sacrifice. So he would have instead incurred whatever the penalties would be for knowingly transgressing whatever the issue was. So when we say this, we're reminded of our earlier sections where in order for us to hit the tripwire of this type of atonement, perfect storm of the person made the decision by mistake and the person acted upon the decision still thinking mistakenly that it was okay. If they knowingly said the wrong decision, no, that's perfectly fine, that corpse is absolutely not causing any ritual contamination, then they don't get this form of atonement. And same way, if they've made a decision by mistake, but as they're acting on it, they know it's wrong, then they still do not use this particular form of atonement. They will have to deal with the repercussions of whatever sin it is that they're transgressing.
They can't just bring a bull and say, okay, now I'm cleared of sin. They have to deal with.
It's not a question of getting away with or one is more expensive than the other. It's not appropriate. It doesn't fit this particular case. It's kind of like, in various criminal cases, there may be issues of fraud or embezzlement and things like that, but often there are legal definitions that you need to meet certain criteria before the prosecution can get you for fraud. Right? They might be able to get you for stealing, but they probably can't get you for fraud unless you hit certain requirements. Doesn't mean you're getting away with whatever it is you did. It just means you're not being punished or you're not falling under the law of that particular statute. That's the way to explain it. Does that sound good for somebody who's actually in the legal? Yeah, right. Right. If you don't hit those particular points of the statute, then you're not covered by it. Doesn't mean you're off the hook. It just means that statute doesn't apply to this particular set of actions. And that's what we're dealing with here. So the priest makes a decision, knowingly wrong. He is no longer falling under this statute. He's now dealing with it as though it's a regular willful transgression, which is in general worse, but it depends on what he's doing. 2-2.
2 or 2-1?
We just did 2-1. So now we're on 2-2.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Well, no. I mean, chapter 2, Mishnah 2.
Mishnah 2.
But now Mishnah 2.1. Yes.
An anointed high priest who rendered an errant decision alone and acted accordingly alone, he makes his atonement alone.
Right. So again, if he is acting alone, it's just him that's involved with it, and therefore his atonement comes through him alone. Pretty straightforward, fairly logical.
If he rendered his ruling together with the court of the congregation, and acted accordingly together with the congregation, he makes his atonement together with the congregation.
Right? So if the priest and the Sanhedrin are sitting together and they come up with this decision and they're both wrong, or collectively they are all wrong, then collectively they are all going to be involved in the atonement. It's not going to be split up into his atonement and their atonement.
For the court is not liable unless they rule to annul part of a commandment and to retain a part of it. And so it is with the anointed high priest.
Right. So this is actually more of a reminder. Don't think of 3 as following on straight from 2. This part 3 is really trying to remind us that just as a court is only liable if they annul part rather than the whole, so too for a high priest. If he makes his decision annulling an entire mitzvah, then he does not fall under this category of law. He is now just going to deal with uprooting the Torah, as opposed to if he makes a mistake with regards to a part of a law, a subcategory of law, a point of law, if you will, right? He's not saying murder's fine. He's saying that's not murder. And he's wrong. In that particular case, it is murder. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. And then part B is going to be part A is going to be much the same.
Nor are they liable for idolatry unless they ruled to annul the law in part and to retain it in part.
Right. So again, if you say idolatry is absolutely fine, then you've got a whole different world of problems going on here. You're not using this particular atonement sacrifice. On the other hand, if you say this isn't idolatry, well, that's a different kind of mistake, and it's a subcategory mistake. Rather than saying idolatry's gone, you're just saying bowing isn't an issue, which of course is a mistake. There are other gray areas where someone might be able to make a mistake that later they would realize, oops, and then this whole process would be triggered. Make sense? Yes, no, maybe. So this is very similar to things we've already covered. We're just applying it to the high priest. So hopefully it makes some sense, but if not, it's okay to ask. All right, chapter 2, Mishnah 3.
The court is not obligated to bring a sacrifice except where ignorance of the law was accompanied by an unwitting action, and so it is with the anointed priest.
And read part A.
Nor is obligation incurred in the case of idolatry unless ignorance of the law was accompanied by an unwitting action.
All right, so first of all, that should at this point of our Mishnah seem, yeah, right? That seems obvious to you. That you have to make the mistaken judgment and somebody needs to act on it in order for this to all happen, because that's what the Torah itself says. If that seems like you would have liked to have heard this at the beginning of the entire section, Masechet of Horayot, yeah, you and me both. This is a great reminder that the Mishnah was not always organized in a way that we, as modern European educated people, would like to see things organized. It was organized as a set of notes as an aid to what you learned from your teacher, that you would be able to review and understand even in your teacher's absence. This is the Cliff Note version, if you will, right? These are the study notes, and the study notes were arranged to make them easier to memorize, make them easier to learn from all on their own. And so really, really important, like first principle issues are now happening halfway into the section, because you would never just start on your own, right? Just like us, when we started, I filled in an awful lot of information. That's how people have studied Mishnah for thousands of years, is their teacher teaches, and then the Mishnah reinforces those points. You shouldn't expect to be able to sit down and begin a Mishnah with the first page, first Mishnah, and it's all going to be laid out to you like a textbook. That wasn't how it was written, and it's not wrong for failing to do that. Goal. Now, the other thing that sometimes is hard is we don't always appreciate a certain mnemonic subtleties of how the editors thought this order would be easier for the average student to retain the knowledge with. It's not always apparent to us. Sometimes it is, but it's not always apparent. But suffice it to say, we're still studying it after 2,000 plus years. I mean, well, the oral law in general, the Mishnah for the last 1,700 years. They did a pretty good job. It is still working. So we can't complain too much. But yes, it would have been nice from a textbook point of view if we'd started off with this Mishnah rather than getting to it in chapter 2. And the second part of it is going to be even more illuminating and would have been great if it was stamped on that front page.
The court is not obligated unless they rule concerning a prohibition, the punishment for which is correct intentionally, and a sin offering if transgressed unwittingly, and so it is with the anointed priest.
And go ahead and read part 2. It's the same thing.
Nor is obligation incurred in the case of idolatry unless concerning a matter the punishment for which is correct, if it was transgressed intentionally, and a sin offering if transgressed unwittingly.
Okay, we're going to get to some cases where that is going to give us some sins where they don't meet that criteria, so that criteria is important. But frameworks that the rabbis were able to transmit and deduce from the Torah itself when the Torah discusses these types of cases. We have to have a mistaken judgment followed by a mistaken action. Transgression where if you were doing it on purpose, it would be karet, but if you're doing it on accident, then you would bring a chatat, a sin offering. And if you hit those criteria, majority issues in the whole community and all of those other things that we've now already discussed, then and only then bring on the bull.
Who's correct?
Karet is the Hebrew word that literally means to be cut off. It's usually translated as being spiritual excision. It means to be cut off from God. Some people who try to translate it as being like cut off from the community, but as the community did not have a automatic response for things that were karet that would push someone out of the community, that doesn't seem to be an appropriate translation. What the rabbis do say is that once you have committed a transgression for karet and have not made atonement, you are liable for death at the hands of heaven. Basically, you have told God, I don't really care about living in your world. If you want to snuff me out, go ahead. And God may take you up on that offer. So if you make such a transgression, you should probably make amends very quickly. All right. 2-4, we're flying along.
Yeah.
This isn't a long Masechet. We'll see how long it takes us to finish.
The court is not obligated to bring a sacrifice for the transgression of a positive or a negative commandment relating to the temple.
Okay. So remember how I said that the type of transgression was going to be important and rule out certain transgressions from falling under the category of this law? It's happening right here, right now. So transgressions for positive and negative commandments relating to the temple, in particular things of like ritual purity. The atonement for those was set on a sliding scale, meaning that if you were wealthy, you brought a bull. If you were less wealthy, you brought goats and sheep, and all the way down to the bottom of bringing doves and grain offerings. So there was a sliding scale. Well, because it's a sliding scale, it doesn't fall under the neat category of sin offering. And therefore, if the court makes rulings on that matter, responsible for this, which means the person who actually transgressed is responsible for it, and they would have to bring the offering. Make sense? Okay, now we're going to get something new in the next line.
Nor does anyone bring an asham talui for the transgression of a positive or negative commandment relating to the temple.
All right, so this is a kind of by the way. An asham talui is a offering that is brought, it literally means like a hanging offering, a suspended offering. The actual, hanging of anything. But it is an offering brought when there is a doubt that you have committed a transgression. We already know that if you made a mistake and committed a transgression, you have to bring an offering. But what if you're not sure if you made a mistake? Do you have to bring an offering? And the answer generally is yes, right? Well, it's kind of like what Job would do, right? If you think that there's a likelihood that you committed a transgression, but you're not sure that you committed a transgression, you can't bring the actual sacrifice for the transgression, what you did, right? It may not be appropriate. And you don't just keep bringing on sacrifices and calling them sin offerings if you didn't actually sin. Again, the rabbis were not about just kill all the animals and let God sort it out. They wanted to make sure that the right offering was being done for the right transgression. If you're not sure if you transgressed, you can't bring the, in quote, right offering. And so instead you'd bring an asham talui. It's a different type of offering to cover your bases when you weren't even sure whether the bases need covering.
Examples for those, do you know?
The explanations give a great example of the case of chelev. Chelev is the fat that, if you watch my class on kashrut, we're not allowed to eat because it was only used on the altar. The case they give in the explanation is, imagine you have two bits of fat. One of them is regular fat, and one of them is this chelev fat, this fat used on the altar. And you turn your back, and then you turn back around, and you eat one, and then you go, wait, which one was
Which one was which?
which? One was which? Well, that was in the knock, was it?
Yeah.
Okay. Must be the building settling. Which one was which? 50-50 chance that you've committed a transgression. Both of them, now you have definitely transgressed. And that means you would bring a regular sin offering. But, I mean, not that you should eat both of them as a way of fixing it, because now you may be deliberately, unwittingly doing something. But if you sat down, ate them both, and then wait a minute, one of those was the forbidden fat, then you have definitely eaten forbidden fat. You definitely have transgressed by mistake, and you bring the offering. You don't know whether you've transgressed. There's a 50-50 chance you transgressed. And therefore, you bring an Asham Talui instead. Make sense? Okay. Part 2.
But they are liable for the transgression of a positive or a negative commandment relating to the menstruant. Individuals bring an Asham Talui for the transgression of a positive or negative commandment relating to the menstruant. Which is the positive commandment relating to the menstruant? Separate yourself from the menstruant. And the negative commandment? Do not have sexual relations with the menstruant.
All right. So similar but different to the temple purity laws, the laws of purity regarding husband and wife. For those, they do bring a offering if they happen to make a mistake. So if they say it's okay to be together when really they shouldn't be, to bring an offering. Make sense? And so you might have thought, because that's another purity issue, that it was covered by the first half of the Mishnah. And so the Mishnah is telling us, no. This is actually a special case where it is covered by the laws of Horayot, of these false decisions. Not false, that sounds like too intentional, these mistaken decisions. Good? All right. You okay to keep going on? I know it's a lot of material. All right. So, kings, right? Rulers, chieftains, they are also covered in the laws of Vayikra and the laws of Leviticus. So we have both courts, we have all of them together. We have courts, we have the Kohanim, and we have the leaders of the people. All of them have opportunities for messing up. And all of them, if they make mess ups that are like this, atonement. And as we were discussing just a little bit before we began, one of the things that's amazing in the Torah is that it already built into it. From the very first moment that we are, even before we've inaugurated the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and even before we really got going as a people, make mistakes, people. And this is what they're going to do to fix it. I mean, it's a remarkably human admission that God is saying that, I know what you're like. You're going to make mistakes, and your leaders are definitely going to make mistakes, and their mistakes are going to affect a lot more than just themselves. Here's how we're going to handle it.
But the mistake they pay with karet. That was a punishment by God.
Well,
They died both.
for willful mistakes. Remember, if you do it deliberately, if you know you're making a mistake, it's not a mistake. Something that when I work with the kids, I try to teach them these things, that you can't say it was, I'm sorry, it was a mistake if you meant to do it, right? You punch someone in the face, that's not a mistake. Certainly not an accident, right? You did that on purpose. You may now regret what you did, and I certainly hope that you do. But it wasn't a mistake that you punched them. And it's important to recognize that with all the information, and choosing wrong is not a mistake. It's wrong. And sometimes we've lost sight of that, of just saying, no, you chose badly. If you had all the information and you knew what was right and you knew what was wrong and you picked wrong, that's not an oops. Right? That's like looking at the math problem and saying, I know 2 + 2 = 4, but I'm going to write 5 because it's my lucky number. Don't be surprised when there's a big red X on the math test. Right? Okay, so let's get into the meat of Mishnah 5, part 1.
The court is not obligated to bring an offering for an errant ruling relating to the hearing of the voice of adjuration, for an oath made by an expression,
This is a list.
or for impurity relating to the temple and its holy things.
Okay, so most of those are pretty clear, right? Impurity relating to the temple and its holy things, similar to what we discussed in the last Mishnah. An oath made by an expression. You know, if someone takes a vow and makes an oath in that way, if they make a mistake for these types of things, we don't trip the wire of these things. The earlier one, the voice of adjuration. This is the technical term in the rabbinic language for when somebody has been asked to swear that they have no testimony to provide, and they swear falsely. Right, so what? For them, willingly, but the mistake in this case would be if the court made a mistake in the ruling regarding somebody who was making a claim of whether they had testimony. Right, so we're 1 degree removed because it's the court's ruling that's the question here. But yes, in general, the law is if the court comes to you and says, do you have testimony regarding this case? Say, well, we will make you take an oath. We'll adjure you. That's the fancy English word for make you take a vow. It's, I solemnly swear, blah, blah, blah. That's an adjuration. I don't get to use the word enough, so I'm going to use it as much as I can tonight. So when they adjure a witness or a potential witness and the witness lies regarding whether they have testimony or not, if the court makes a mistaken ruling regarding their declaration of whether or not they have testimony to bring the sacrifice. Too long of a chain of like complicated levels?
Not because they're not really at fault because.
Well, they're at fault because they made a mistaken ruling.
But there's no way they would know that whether the other person actually had their testimony or not, right?
But there are other ways to make mistakes in the court. Perhaps they adjured them incorrectly. Perhaps they didn't think an adjuration was needed in this case, or maybe they thought it was needed and it wasn't. Right? So there are other mistakes they can do for the process. They don't know for that person, unless they actually do know they have testimony and they're willing to overlook it, but that goes in the level of willful ignorance rather than mistaken. There are procedural questions, I guess you could say, that the court might make.
Procedural mistake.
That would be the most common in a case like that, yes. All right, and now to the king. Part 2.
No, yeah,
We're not on
no,
Mishnah 6 yet.
And the ruler is similarly exempt. These are the words of Rabbi Yosef Hagalili.
Right, so he says, yeah,
The ruler is exempt.
the prince, the ruler, the king has the same kind of status in these cases. However,
Rabbi Akiva says the ruler is liable in the case of all of these except that of hearing the voice of adjuration, because the king may neither judge nor be judged, neither may he testify, nor may others testify against him.
okay, which is a very interesting rule about the king, and unfortunately the status that was necessary in order to maintain, if you will, to in the ancient world have enough fear of the king that people would be in awe of the king and therefore obey the commandments, because without that, in the ancient world, society was likely to decay into anarchy. Thank God we now live in a society where we do not have a standard of treating our rulers, our lives in their hands, because we can have a society that doesn't need that in order to not murder each other. But why would the king be exempt from these other cases? Well, it goes back to our sliding case, our sliding scale of payment. One of the main reasons for the exemption was that there's a sliding scale, which means it doesn't fall under the neat category offering. But remember how the scale slid? What was the defining reason why someone might bring a more expensive sacrifice and someone would bring a less expensive one? Why do some people have to bring a more expensive sacrifice?
They have more money.
They got more money, right? And some people have less. And so there's a sliding scale based upon your economic capacity. This is the king we're talking about, says Rabbi Akiva. What, he's going to wake up tomorrow poor? Right? If there's any doubt what sacrifice he would bring involved in one of these mistakes? There's no doubt, right? He will bring the most expensive sacrifice. I mean, after all, if he doesn't have enough money, he can just go take it from someone. He's the king.
I thought that the maximum could be a board.
Mhm.
Because if you are doing a parallelism with the other cases, so the weight will be the same as the court or the Supreme Sacerdote.
Yes.
So it should be a board. And I think the king can afford a board.
And that's the point. And that's why Rabbi Akiva says that the king is responsible for these things, because there's no sliding scale involved for the king, because the king has very deep pockets. It's good to be the king. I think a very famous Jew said that once. Mel Brooks. You know what? I think we can just squeeze in 2:6.
For all the commandments of the Torah, the penalty for which, if committed intentionally, is karet, and if committed unwittingly, a sin offering, the individual brings as an offering a lamb or a goat.
All right, so that's the general rule for all of us regular schmoes.
The ruler brings a goat, the priest and the court bring a bull.
Right? So there is a fixed measure for the other categories. For the rest of us, it's a lamb or a goat. For the king, it's a goat, because that's slightly higher in status in general. And for the anointed priest in the court, they have to bring the bull. And that, represents their status, if you will, with regards to this particular law.
So why the king is under the Cohen and the court in a punishment?
So the question is, why did the Torah say that's what he brings? Because the Torah is the one that actually set what he brings. That's if you look in the notes, it's in chapter 4, 22, 23. Whereas the issue of the court, we're in chapter 4, 3 and 13, 14. So the question is not, why did the rabbis set that level? It's why did the Torah set that level? And we can hypothesize. Unfortunately, the Torah didn't leave us footnotes. It didn't explain exactly why it did what it did. But in general, considered to be less liable for these sorts of things because they had less status vis-a-vis the rulings of Jewish law, of commandments. Their job was not meant to be making mitzvah decisions. Their law was, where should we build the road, new aqueduct, those types of kingly duties. Executive duties, exactly, rather than legislative duties, which is really what interpreting Torah is. What's that? Well, I mean, that is legislative by Jewish standards, yes. You mean for the king or for who?
Oh, when you said legislator, I thought it was more almost like a common law thing.
The meta question of whether Judaism functioned as a legislative with an executive or whether it's that functioned as a active judiciary with an executive is a much longer conversation outside of the class, because there are elements of both, of legislation when the sages in the courts are going to set a precedent for enacting what we call takanot, protective either protections around commandments or new institutions like the ketubah that are going to create new in order to achieve a goal of the Torah. Does that count as legislation or does that count as judicial decision making?
But Takano was law beyond the Torah, basically.
But it has so many different meanings, right? It's a law that isn't found in the Torah,
Right.
but it's made with the authority of the Torah that was granted to the sages to make pronouncements as needed by the Torah. So is that beyond the Torah or is that fulfilling Torah? Definitely the rabbis felt that they were fulfilling Torah when they made a decision, for example, like having a ketubah.
The king could do Takano, right?
The king could do almost anything he wanted as long as he didn't violate the Torah. The king had really absolute monarchical power. But it wasn't like a constitutional monarchy. And certainly there were major limits when it came to transgressing any of the Torah laws. But when it wasn't the Torah law, the king could do an awful lot outside the normal bounds of what would be expected. Part 2.
Part 2. In the case of idolatry, the individual and the ruler and the anointed priest bring a goat, while the court brings a bull and a goat, the bull for a burnt offering and the goat for a sin offering.
And again, those are based on the verses as mentioned in the footnotes. All right. Whew. Heavy lifting tonight, yes? Yes. We'll have to pick something a little bit more